Good to see you all. Really good to see you all. Good to be back. 2 weeks off, and it was so sweet. It was so sweet. I really needed that vacation, and I'm so grateful for it. The one pain that I had over the last 2 weeks was this sounds sort of maudlin, but it's true. I want this class to be every single week, and it's more than just the great joy in my life, which it is, but it is also a belief that I have that we should always be in the weekly Parsha. That's one of the rhythms of our life. In fact, Jewish law mandates that you go through the Parsha twice every week in the original and once in translation or commentary. So I recommend that to you. But I really believe in that, and so it's hard for me to. I want to just every week, no matter where I am in the world, to be studying Parsha on Thursday at noon with you all. But it's good to take a vacation. I needed one. I took it. I promised that I would find substitutes, but I never found ones that I wanted to trust this class with. So here I am. I'm back, and thanks for. I hope you studied the Parsha. In the meantime, I hope you got a little bit of a fix from our podcast. And just remember that we also have a podcast, and it's just 10 or 15 minutes long as opposed to this 1 hour class. I think that there's nothing better than discussing it all together and analyzing in real time. So this is the format I most enjoy, but the podcast is bite-sized, and it's convenient if you ever can't make this as I couldn't the last 2 weeks. And we did release 2 podcasts. Okay, so here's what we're looking at today. And I just I've done this before. I found this, this is one of the new phrases of our culture, but I found it very useful, the phrase trigger warning, for teaching, because I really do need to issue one today, because the material, I'm coming back after 2 weeks, and I'm coming back with a banger, or more like a punch. The material we're going to look at today is definitely triggering. We're looking at cases of assault and death and family fighting, domestic fighting. I mean, just really, really difficult stuff. And so I do want, if that feels like maybe that's not the right mood for you today, then I totally understand. I also get a little nervous teaching this kind of stuff, as a lover of this tradition, as a teacher of this tradition. You sometimes have a tendency to skip over the ugly stuff, because you want other people to love this tradition and this Torah, but that's foolish, of course, because eventually it's just in there. You're going to encounter the difficult stuff, the good, bad, and the ugly. But also, I felt, as I started to look through the Parsha this week, that the cases we're going to look at, we have to look at them, because that's just the point of our discussion today. That they raise this question, which is a question that we must ask ourselves as students of Torah. What do we do when we come across these parts of the Torah that are so disturbing? What do we do with this material? How do we understand it? How do we interpret it? How do we accept it? How do we reject it? What do we do with it? And that's a necessary question to ask, because the Torah is disturbing, not just because, we're modern people and we have different values now, but also because it seems sometimes that the Torah means to disturb us. Certainly the story of the binding of Isaac is the most classic example. That story is not meant to be enjoyed. That is a story that's meant to disturb. And that seems clear. Whatever the message, the moral takeaway is, that's a story that's meant to disturb. And when we open this week's Parsha, we also find, I think, an unusually savage, an especially disturbing series of laws. And you feel that the Torah is almost poking us, punching us, assaulting us with these cases, and we have to figure out what to do with them. And our lens today is going to be to figure out what the rabbis, our sages of old, did with these cases, because, surprise, or no surprise if you know them, the rabbis did not reject the material they found in the Torah, nor did they always just accept it. Okay, those are options we have. We could find disturbing material in Torah and just throw it out. We're not interested. We also have the option to say whatever the Torah says, who are we to question it? But that neither of those is the rabbinic approach or approaches. We're going to look at several today, and I do not promise that you will leave this class feeling happy and good about our tradition, but I do promise that we're going to ask very important, necessary questions today that make us wiser, more sophisticated, and maybe more equipped students of our tradition. Okay, so with that, let's jump in. We'll say a blessing, and then and let me just say one other thing. After all that doom and gloom, which is that it was our captain here, Vera. It was her birthday yesterday, and Vera edits our podcast and our classes, which we also release, and runs this to make sure that everything's in place and that I don't have to worry about the technical and the Torah at the same time. So love to you, Vera, and happy birthday. Hope it was a really good one. Okay, let's say a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. All right, here we go. And we're going to look at these. There are 74 laws in Parshat Teitzei. We're in the middle now of the book of Deuteronomy. 74 laws. That is, or at least by the traditional counting, that is the most of any Parsha. This Parsha has more laws than any other Parsha. So 74 laws, and it's the first four that we're going to look at today. And as I said, for all of those laws covering all kinds of topics, a veritable catalog of laws, the opening law. Why would you pick this one to open with? Why would you pick this one and then the next one and then the next one? Okay, so with warnings in place and some degree of trembling, let's head into the Parsha. So I'm going to put a source sheet here now into the chat. Okay, and the first law, you may know it by name if you are a regular reader of the Torah, is the law of the Eshet Yafat Toar, the woman, the beautiful woman, the law of the beautiful woman. That sounds nice, but it's not nice. The woman of beautiful form. It is a law that regulates conduct in times of war. Because ki teitzei means when you go out. Ki teitzei lemilchama, when you go out to war. So let's take a look here and prepare to be disturbed. Okay. Ki teitzei lemilchama, alo ovecha. Untano Adonai Elohecha biyadcha v'shivita shivyo. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the eternal your God delivers them into your hand, into your power, and you take some of them captive. Okay. Now, along the way here, we're gonna end up looking at capital punishment, laws of wars. These are things which are not pleasant, but maybe you could say they're necessary. Do we need laws like this? So when you think about taking captive, that already is an unpleasant idea. Humans taking one another. War itself is an unpleasant. But this particular law is more than just unpleasant. Okay, and then among the captives, Rita b'shivya eshet yafat tohar. When you see among the captives a beautiful woman, a woman of beautiful form, and that language is language we've seen before to describe certain women in the Torah, Rachel among them, but actually Joseph as well. Right, so it's classic language for a beautiful person. So you see a beautiful woman, v'chashakta ba, and you desire her. V'lekachta lecha leisha, and you take her as your wife, or I don't know, is wife the right word here? You take her as your woman, but the word here is the same word that we use for wife. You take her as your wife. So you are going to war, you take a captive, and now you just like one of them. Now, of course, this happens. Though this is rape in times of war, unfortunately, is all too common. But this is a strange case of it where you take her and now she's yours. You've taken her on as a wife / prisoner. Okay. So here's the law. So that's the setting, and we're not disturbed yet. I'm sure we are, but it gets worse. Okay, you take her and you bring her into your house, and she shall trim her hair, maybe shave her head, and let her nails grow. Now that's strange. She shall shave her head. And I actually think that's what it is. Gilchad Rosha. I think this is a bad translation. She shall. Let's just make it, because I think the Torah means to have this imagery. Shave her head, let her nails grow, and remove her captive's garb. She shall spend a month's time sitting in your house, 1 month sitting in your house, crying over her father and mother. My God. Crying over her father and mother. And after that, you may come to her and thus become her husband, and she shall be your wife. Okay. Like, why? We can already ask, why all this stuff? Why the month? Why all of these regulations? But why also does the Torah allow this at all? As if it's some sort of regular, I don't know, move towards, or we would call it marriage, but it's marriage and imprisonment all at once. Okay. Then, if that weren't bad enough, should you no longer desire, what if you're done with her? You must release her outright. You must not sell her for money. I mean, I guess that's good. And the language here the reasoning is strange. Since you caused her to suffer, you must not treat her like a slave. I don't even know what to do with that. Okay, fine. You know what? I need to stop offering commentary, but I just want to give you the feeling of every word, every line here. I'm just like, I'm shaken in another direction. I don't. Okay. All right. So this is the first case, the case of Eshet Yefator, and we could spend many hours just dealing with our reactions to this case. But today, I want you to just see the sweep here of one law after another, one punch after another. Okay, so that's law one. Law two, and this one actually we did the podcast on this week. So Vera, if you want to put the podcast into the chat, we did a whole discussion of this law, but we're just going to read it and incorporate it into our list today. Okay, so second law on the list: if a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved. Okay, so that's already awful. I mean, what a terrible situation. This one isn't necessarily morally wrong. It's just what a horrible situation. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved, and unloved is not the right translation. It's really hated. Hated. It's bad, it's bad. And the hated have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the unloved one. When he wills his property to his sons, he may not treat as firstborn the son of the loved one in disregard of the son of the unloved one who is older. Instead, he must accept the firstborn, the son of the unloved one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses. That's the law. The firstborn takes what's called the birthright, right? The double portion. Since he is the first fruit of his vigor, the birthright is his due. Okay? So what's the law there? If you have two wives and you don't really like one of them, even though they've given you your heir, I'm thinking of the word heir because I'm watching House of Dragons, right? So it's like that kind of like, we're familiar with this from like medieval kings, and like the firstborn gets to be the king, even though the secondborn is the more noble, et cetera. So, it's like that you could dramatize it that way. But in this case, we know the legend that this evokes, right? It's Jacob that had two wives and actually did favor the youngest son. So this is This is an interesting law, and we discussed this in the podcast because it seems to reflect back on mistakes that have been made. But here we have this terrible case of a father that wants to treat both one of his wives and one of his sons like lesser beings. Just terrible. Okay, not as alarming as the first case, but awful. Okay, third case is the case, also a classic, of Ben Sorer Umore, the wayward and defiant son, or the wayward and rebellious son. If a man has a wayward and defiant son, Ben Sorer Umore, who does not heed his father and mother, and does not obey them even after they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town, to the gate in that place. And they shall say to the elders of that town, this son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. And actually, we're going to need to change this translation too, because this will be important. He does not listen to our voice. Okay, that's the actual language there. Einenu shomea bekolenu. He does not listen to our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the people of the town shall stone him to death. All the people of the town shall stone him to death. Thus you shall sweep evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear and be afraid. Now, what? I mean, this presumably is about more than just a problem kid, but someone who's a tyrant, a criminal, a really bad guy. But even so, well, first of all, is he such a bad guy? A glutton and a drunkard? I mean, that's not great, but give me a break. That's not a criminal. But also, what parents are these that brought their son to the court to be hopefully stoned? What kind of law is this? What kind of parents are this? What kind of law is this? What kind of society is this? I mean, it's just you get a sense like this is a terrible society. It's all full of war and jealousy and the bad children and bad parents and bad courts and bad laws. And what's going on here? Okay. Richard's anticipating. I see that in the chat. But we'll soon get to that. Let me give you just the last law in a sweep of. We're going to need all of these because we're going to do some thinking about how they even interconnect. But the last law is just capital punishment, which does, exist in the Torah. People can be. The rabbis roll it back a lot, but there is capital punishment in the Torah. We just saw it. And here's another version of it. If a man is guilty of a capital of offense, and is put to death, and you hang him on a tree. All right, already unpleasant imagery to say the least. You must not let the corpse hanging on. They turned it to a stake, but that's not right. Sorry, I didn't have time to retranslate today. On the tree. You must not let the corpse remain hanging on the tree overnight, but must bury it the same day. For an impaled body is a curse to God. A body hanging there is a curse to God. Right? They keep changing it to stake, but it really isn't stake. For a body hanging there, a body hanging there. Sorry about this. Is a curse to God. I'm just catching up, from my vacation. I haven't had time for any kind of real preparation. So the body hanging there is a curse to God. You shall not defile the land that the eternal your God is giving you to possess. Okay. All right, so that's it. Those are the 4 laws. The laws of the woman of beautiful form, really the woman that you take captive in war and make your wife. The law of the 2 wives, one loved and one hated, and how you can't show preferential treatment to the loved one if the son of the loved one isn't the oldest. The law of Ben Sora and Mored, the wicked and the wayward and defiant son, the rebellious son, the disloyal. They don't know exactly how to translate those 2 terms, but something bad about that son, whose parents want to have him killed. And then the hanging man. right? The hanging man. Just, I mean, the very image of a hanging man, in this country, surely with our legacy, our terrible legacy of hangings, right? It's just disturbing in and of itself, and the Torah seems to be disturbed by it. But that's sort of the central question here. What is the Torah doing? Because on the one hand, the Torah seems to present these cases as cases of tragedy, cases of misfortune and calamity and terrible cases. The Torah doesn't seem to be happy with any of these situations, does it? It's not celebrating your capture of this woman, but it isn't exactly prohibiting it either. Instead, it's like a slight modification. It's not don't hang the guy, it's don't leave him hanging. Okay. Of course, we could analyze each case separately, and there are probably different reasons for all these cases. So I don't want to go drill down too deeply into, well, this one or this one. But right now, I just want to take a breath here and ask, what is the Torah doing? What is the Torah up to with these terrible, terrible cases and the slight pushback on what seems to be the moral dilemma within them? Okay, so let's start to hear from folks, and then we'll turn and look at what the rabbis have to say. So Matt Silverstein.
So part of what gets me, and I looked at also the bit before about when the body dies, is these are very legalistic sort of things. It's not ritual. It's not religious. This is legalistic. This is process stuff. And that's intriguing me because it's throwing in morality, but it's process stuff. And I just want to point out a little thing, and I'll let go, that has always bothered me is you've got a rebellious son, so tell people he's a drunkard. And that gives me no clue as to where the offense is, what I'm supposed to, is like, what if he's not a drunkard? Do I say he's a drunkard because that's formulistic? Is that drunkard an I mean, I have no idea how to use that. And yet this is process. This is measure the distance. And here's, 30 days for the woman you kept. This is process. This is doing stuff. And I have no idea, even if I want to kill the children, I know the rabbis don't want to do that, but even if I want to, I don't know how to go forward with that. I don't know where to go. I'm lost.
Okay, good. So Matt gives us a couple of really valuable points of consideration, somewhat in tension with one another. In other words, Matt offers a kind of approach to our problem, which is to say, yeah, this is difficult stuff, but they are the laws that are dealing with difficult. This is legalistic, and they might not be the laws we would want, but many of us don't want capital punishment in our own society, and it exists. Many of us would prefer there was no war at all, and it exists. These are the laws that are dealing with the process of how you move through the world's difficult situations, and in some ways, it's not a value statement, a celebration, an affirmation. It's a mechanism. So maybe that helps a little bit. But then Matt says, but now that I've said that it's a process, a mechanism, I mean, how technical and legalistic and well structured is this process after all? I mean, we seem to be dealing with the law is telling me that I leave this woman in my house. The law is telling me she should cry. Right? The law is telling me that this kid is a drunkard. These things seem very specific. The law is telling me I don't love that woman, I love that woman. It seems like the cases don't feel like purely legalistic cases. It feels like, like we're doing deep therapy here. So on the one hand, legalistic, and on the other hand, like kind of murky, unclear, interpersonal legalistic formulas here that it's hard to know what to do with. Okay, let's keep going. Payam?
Draconian laws exist to temper our worst natural tendencies. They're not about the person being punished. So the second one is telling the husband, don't hate your wife, because if you hate your wife, then her son's going to inherit everything and wreak his revenge on you. The third one is trying to prevent the parents from being so stubborn, because the punishment is they're going to have to take him out to the gates and have him stoned to death. And the first one is don't lust after your enemies, because you're going to have a bald woman with long nails in your house weeping for a month.
Yeah.
So they're not about the person being punished. They're about ourselves and the things we want, and saying, if this is what you want, this is what you're going to get. So don't want that.
Okay, great. Payam sets us up perfectly with that interpretation. That the Payam suggests that these laws are speaking to the worst in us, to our worst instincts, and warning us almost. Now, with that said, I cannot help but turn to. I'm hearing someone who's not muted. Who is it? Who is that? Okay. With that said, I can't help but now turn to one of these rabbinic approaches. I was going to do another one first, but I can't let a thought like that come into our space and not connect it to, because Payam is, we say in the tradition, Baruch shekivanta, blessed are you whose mind went where the sages' minds went. Blessed is your consciousness, almost, right? So Baruch shekivanta Payam, because that approach is exactly the approach that Rashi takes. Rashi, our most famous commentator, and Rashi is drawing from the rabbis of old. When I refer to the rabbis, I'm referring to the rabbis of the Talmudic period, and it is their reaction to these disturbing cases that is the subject of our discussion today. There's a meta subject, which is our reaction to these cases, but we're gonna use the rabbis and their responses to these cases to see what is possible, and what our tradition suggests we do when we are disturbed. So here I'm going to I was going to look at this case from the Talmud first. And this case in the Talmud deals with the wayward and defiant son, but I'm going to come back to that. We're going to look at three different approaches today, but I want to look at the second approach first because it's Payam's approach, the one he just mentioned. It almost Payam, maybe Payam's read this Rashi before, but it's almost exactly what Payam said. So this is the Rashi on our first case, and you would take her as your wife. Sure. And Rashi says, Lo dibra Torah ella k'neged yetzer hara. The Torah is speaking directly to the evil inclination. Now, okay, Payam just sort of fleshed that out, but I want you to continue to meditate on that, what that might mean. The Torah is speaking to our worst instincts, to the evil inclination within us. The Torah is talking to someone who wants to do a bad thing. For if the Holy Blessed One did not permit her to him as a wife, he would marry her anyway, even though it was forbidden. Okay, these are both strange suggestions. The first one is Payam's suggestion that the Torah is talking to what the Torah, God, Moses, whatever, knows is the worst part of us and trying to caution against that, to warn us. So that's already like a strange approach. But then Rashi says also that the Torah not only thinks that we would do bad things, but that if the Torah prohibited them, certain kinds of bad things, we would ignore the Torah and do it anyway. I don't know, what does that mean? Maybe the idea is in the heat of war, soldiers become so, I don't know, like untethered in violence that they're no longer able to contain themselves, or is this just? Well, I mean, I'm not. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. Okay, and I want to just with that approach, I want to hear what you think about this approach. But let me fill it out a little bit more, because Rashi also moves through the case and explains how the Torah is speaking directly to the evil inclination. So then Rashi says, now here's what I'm going to do. We looked at the first half of this Rashi. I'm going to skip this and come back to it. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to skip this second half and come back to it. I want to go now to the Rashi that speaks about let her nails grow. Why let her nails grow? And remember, shave her head. She grows them out so that she should become repulsive to her captor. Kadeshet tit navel, So she's become repulsive to her captor. And she sits in your house, in the house in which he constantly uses. So when he goes in, he encounters her. And when he leaves, he encounters her. He sees her endless crying and sees her neglected appearance. And all of this in order that she should become undesirable to him. Okay, so now you have an approach, and you can see Rashi's quoting from all kinds of rabbinic sources earlier than him. So it's a well-established rabbinic model. And the model is this, I think, although disagree with me if you wish to, but the model is you really shouldn't do this, but you're not going to be able to help yourself. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you can do it, but I'm going to place all these regulations on it. And that much okay, since you've allowed me to take her captive, I'll go through this process. But the process is actually meant to make you rethink your choice. The process is meant to make it seem like, whoa, what was I thinking? Because she's no longer beautiful. She's made herself unsightly. And you have to watch her pain. And then at the end of the 30, you can have her as a wife after that, but the Torah hopes to God that you don't. Okay?
On campus. We're currently
Joanne, Torshia Luna, we keep hearing you keep unmuting. Okay, so here we are. That's approach one. It was going to be approach two, but it's Payam's approach. What do you think? It's such a disturbing case, but is that wise? Is that the Torah's psychological brilliance, right? Or at least the Rabbi's psychological brilliance? What do you think of the idea that the Torah might be speaking to our worst instincts and trying indirectly to push us away from? Okay, I see a lot of hands up. Who wants to speak to this? Yael.
I think the Torah Hashem recognizes that we are going to be in periods where our high passions, I'm not even going to call it the evil instinct, Yetzer hara, meaning the high passions. We're going to be furious at our children. This child who is not respectful, not turning out the way we hoped, rebelling against everyone. And in war, which is where, war is the Yetzer hara incarnate. And so our passions are stirred, our blood is hot. And the man sees a beautiful woman. She has long flowing hair and she's perhaps made up. And he takes her and he wants her as a wife. He wants to own her, possess her. So he takes her, but he allows her to mourn. And when we're grieving, we don't cut our nails. She shaves her head. She is her real self without the adornments. And this is the way that we direct our high passion time. And so after that period of 30 days, when she's been real, he's gotten to know her. If he wants to marry her and be a husband to her, he can do that, or he can set her free. And so I think this is addressing the fact that we're not always serene. We have these hot passions in us, and these are codes and steps to take during those times.
Okay, terrific. I love Yael's language and the high passions, and in a sense, I think Yael is saying something similar to what I was saying, which is that there are certain states of high passion where one cannot be expected to act with reason, intelligence, good grace, morality. Sometimes we lose it, right? And Yael filled that out more elegantly than I'll do right now. But she also added something that I think might be an important point for consideration in this model, which is that the case that Rashi is describing is one in which it is not just, oh, she's no longer beautiful, but actually that you've been forced to confront her humanity. And you have been forced to really face, in a time of war, you snatch, you kill, but here you've had to sit and realize that this is a person, and the Torah presumes if you could actually see the humanity of the other, then you wouldn't go through with these these worst instincts, these high passions. Okay, so that is a theory. That is a theory. I see an old friend, Taran. I haven't seen you in a long time. Taran, are you able to unmute?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Nice to see you, Taran.
It's good to see you guys. I saw the post on Facebook like 25 minutes ago, 25 minutes before, and I was like, okay, you know what? I'll come.
Great.
Because this is my B'nai Mitzvah portion. So
okay. So you've looked at it. All right. So what do you think?
Yeah. I'm thinking that like this isn't about our passions. This is about like what was happening on the ground. I don't think that prohibitions in Torah exist if it's not happening on the ground. And I'm going to talk about it from the historical point of view here, because I'm not someone who believes that Torah was like actually given at Sinai. But historically, like if the writers wrote this down for a reason, the writers probably wrote this down because they were doing it and they wanted to make sure that this was something that shifted once like it got out into the mass, like the text itself got out into the masses. Like they didn't like it, they wanted to change it, or maybe not so much for Ben Somer Rare Moreh. Like I don't really know what to do with that, because it seems like a very like it feels very strange, because all of the other pieces of text in this little grouping you've given us seem to be really like, well, this was what was happening on the ground and we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Ben Sorer Moreh doesn't really fit there. And I mean, I feel like the rabbis want to like legislate it out of existence because it is deeply problematic.
Okay, great. Good to have Taran and Taran's mind back in the mix here. So appreciate that. And Taran offers us a different approach, right? Not purely legalistic, and neither purely psychological, but a kind of to looking at the Torah as a real account of what was, a record of the problems in that society. And so call it, the writers, call it God, call it Moses, but the Torah is taking account of such a case because the Torah knows that people are doing this. So how do we deal with it? Well, we're dealing with a document that is trying to make sense of an ancient world that had those problems. If we had a book of law and it included laws against hate crimes, the book wouldn't be saying hate crimes are great. The book would be saying, this is a terrible problem in our society. What do we do? How do we deal with this? Okay, so what we have here is a record of some of the worst crimes or punishments or reactions of our society. Okay, so that's an approach as well. Now, I want to, as we come down to the last quarter hour here, to use Taran's comments also as a kind of a pivot, because they also said that Ben Sorer Moreh, the rebellious son, didn't exactly fit into, like, what is that? Is this a problem in that society? Lots of rebellious sons, lots of drunkards and gluttons. Well, that's a very strange case. And indeed, the rabbis, probably of the four cases we looked at, the rabbis felt most agitated and disturbed by the case of the rebellious son, because they just couldn't believe that is the right punishment. The earlier law, and they might have been, you can see they were disturbed by the person who would want to take a woman captive. And so they're saying, oh, that's not a good instinct. But that's not the Torah's instinct. The Torah is regulating against that. But in the case of the rebellious son, it's the Torah that's mandating the law that the son be killed. It's the Torah's fault, so to speak. I mean, the parents, who are these parents that would bring this case before the court? But the Torah sanctions it. So what do we do with that? Okay, now this is a very famous and important section of the Talmud. If you've never seen it before, and this is what Richard was alluding to before, it never happened. It never happened. That's a good title for the approach that we're going to look at here. This is one of the rabbinic approaches to disturbing material, which is to say, don't worry, it never happened. Now, what does that mean? Let's take a look. You're going to, now, if you came for no other reason, you're going to see one of the most important pieces of Talmud. And it's important for getting a sense of what rabbinic interpretation can look like, and specifically how they find their way around or through laws that they were disturbed by. So here is the classic case of Ben Sora and More as it is interpreted in the Talmud. So we're going to go back. This is the first one I was going to look at, but Payam teed up the second one so nicely for us. So let's now look at the case of the rebellious son in the Talmud. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda taught, if his mother and father are not alike in voice, in appearance, and in height, he cannot be tried as a wayward and defiant son. What? What? Doesn't make any sense at all. If his mother and father are not alike in voice, height, and appearance, he cannot be tried as a wayward and rebellious son. Why? What does that even mean? Well, the Torah says he does not listen to our voice. Remember, I had to change that translation. Einenu shomea bekolenu. The language is not our voices, but our voice, singular. But what does it mean that they singular? Well, now, of course, that's just the way we speak, our voice. But the Torah, or the rabbis more, are using this word, our voice, one voice, to offer a particularly surprising interpretation. Since voice is in the singular, that must mean their voices are alike. It says our voice. So it can't be two different sounds. It has to be one sound, which means they have to have a similar vocal quality. Now, come on. What? Come on. I mean, does anyone buy this? This is crazy. What are you talking about? They have to have a similar, you can't distinguish their voices. But if you thought that was silly, just wait till the next piece of commentary here. If their voices have to be indistinguishable, well, then that means they also have to be alike physically in appearance and height. What? I mean, there's no, that is not a logical inference at all. And also, now that we've gotten to this point, as the Talmud soon says, well, then this is never going to happen. This is never going to happen because we're not going to get a father and mother, right? A man and a woman who have certain biological differences anyway, who are exactly the same in appearance, height, and voice. I mean, maybe once in a while, but this just, come on, that's not. So what happens is we've essentially written this law out of existence. And that's what the Talmud says. What do you mean? According to this opinion, it never happened, nor will it ever happen. Lo haya velo atid lihiyot. It never was, and it never will be. Well, but if so, why would it be written? So why is it even in the Torah? Why is it even in the Torah? And then the punchline, drosh ukabel schar, to interpret it and to receive divine reward for its study. It's just here for us to study and reflect upon. It's here for us to think about. It's not ever meant to be applied. Okay, now, oh, come on. What do you think of that? What do you think of that? I mean, is that a good approach? Do you buy it? How could the rabbis possibly suggest that when they don't like a law of the Torah, don't worry, because it's not real law. It's just a law you think, you learn, you think about, but like it's not meant to be applied, because after all, everybody knows that when this happens, the mother and father have to be exactly the same human being. I mean, come on. Come on. All right. I'm going to turn to Alex, who I haven't seen in a while. Hey, Alex.
Shalom, Rabbi Kasher. It's interesting. This line of thinking by the sages makes me think of the principle of asmachta, where it's a condition or a promise that someone makes, but has no intention of keeping. That this is such an absurd situation that not just one parent but both parents would want to go through with this. That it's an instance of asmachta, that this principle would apply. And really, I think the defense would be that there are few mitzvot that quite reach this level of absurdity of a situation that would happen.
Oh, I love that interpretation. I mean, that was really, really sharp. Really, really sharp, Alex. You hear what Alex is saying? Alex is saying the idea of an asmachta is like, it's not really, it's just a supporting idea. It helps us understand, it's not a real proof. In other words, what Alex is saying is, yeah, the idea that the voice has to be the same, that they don't mean for us to take that literally, but it's a way of saying, this is never going to happen. Two parents are never going to bring their child to the court to be stoned. Come on. Or at least it never should happen. If there are those parents, like, through absurdity, let's write them out of existence, because there's just, what the rabbis are really saying is, this is not real. This can't be real. What do you do in this situation? There's something to think about here about parent and child relations and how we deal with chaos in our society, but you don't really expect that a mother and father, for God's sake, are going to bring their child to be stoned. So, like, this is a way of saying that. This is a way of saying that's not going to happen. I really like that. That's a really, really sharp reading. Okay. I see Noah.
Rabbi Kasher, and what a time since Elul is upon us. Like I said in the chat, we really need to look inwards than outwards. Inwards in our family and in our wider family than the wider world, that we can always think we hear our own voices first, but is it our voice? Is it our brother's voice, our father's, our whoever's voice? That may let us get to see, can we really know who it is, whose voice we have in our ears when we're making a decision? Wow.
This is like, I mean, the rabbinic suggestion here is that we interpret this and we receive reward for our study, and that is, at least that's happening, because these interpretations are just so sharp and incisive. So what Noah says is also a real doozy, which is that the idea, let's think about this conceptually, spiritually, the idea that two people have found one voice. Noah says, suggests to us that we ought to think about the ways in which sometimes our voice is just an adaptation, a merger with the collective voice of the mob of friends. And here it's happening between two people, but we can think about, Noah says, the way in which we're always subject to influence from voices outside of us. And we have to be careful to make sure that we don't just join our voices with the madding crowd. Very, very nice. Very, very nice. Okay, I want to take one more pass at this. I'll call on Kathy, and then we'll look at the third approach.
Well, actually, I was thinking of it sort of going back to what Payam said, because Payam was saying, I was really struck by the fact that it's not really about the people who are involved. It's really about the people whom you're trying to, convince not to think that way. In other words, it's a kind of it's that kind of hypothetical. It becomes this sort of hypothetical that in fact shapes behavior. And that's really where it lies. And so it seems to me that it's not, of course, it has these absurd elements, and I totally, sort of accept everything everybody said so far. But in addition, there is this way in which it's pressing you to the hypotheticals in order to kind of stretch your mind, and to go, okay, what are the limits of how much do the parents need to be in sync in order for them to, go, well, the whole same size, same voice and everything. That's kind of an extreme, but it does take you to a real consideration of the hypotheticals. And it reminds me of other things in the Talmud, like those crazy things about, can an elephant be one of the walls in a sukkah? Now that's crazy. And I actually think that they partly put it in because they had a bit of a sense of humor or dark humor or something like that. But it's also going, what is a wall? What constitutes a wall? And so on the one hand, it is sort of mind games, but I think it's mind games not totally without purpose.
That is a great framing, Kathy. You're right that you're building on some of the comments that we've heard earlier, sort of where Payam started to take us, but you're offering us in using the language of hypotheticals. You're offering us a helpful framework here, because perhaps, Kathy suggests, these are like moral dilemmas, ethical dilemmas. These are like theoretical problems, like the trolley problem, like in the philosophy of ethics, right? If a trolley is going down the track and it's going to kill 5 people and you can divert it, but in diverting it, it'll kill 1 person. Do you pull the lever? Do you take the action to kill that 1 person so that now, does that happen? Oh, all these trolleys rolling around. You got to make sure not to, that's not real. It's about thinking about what do you do in such a situation? And that might be a way of dealing with these cases as well. Very, very helpful. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, and I want to give us the third approach, because in some ways, it's not really an approach to moral problems. It's actually more of an elegant interpretation of all these 4 cases. This is sort of a more literary approach. But remember, we cut off in the middle of one of those Rashis. I'm going to return to it because he says there and in one other place an interesting thing about how these cases might relate to one another, why they might all be presented here in the same sweep. So let's take a look here at the third approach, which is the juxtaposition approach. Okay, we've seen the approach which says that the Torah is speaking only to our worst instincts. We've seen the approach that says, oh, the Torah doesn't really intend for these cases to be ever carried out at all. And now I want to look at the juxtaposition approach. So we're going back to this Rashi. Remember, Rashi says Torah is speaking directly to the evil inclination. Okay, but then take a look at this. Now we have those 4 cases. Okay, however, Rashi says, if he does marry her, the Torah wants to caution him away from marrying her. But if he does, in the end, he will hate her. He will hate her. It will not work out. Why? Because it says just afterwards, if a man has 2 wives, one beloved and another hated. Who is that man? Rashi wants us to, it's this guy who just took the second wife from the battlefield. And in the end, that wasn't his best self. And so he's going to hate her. And I think I want to insert into this. He sort of hates himself for taking her. But he wants to be out of this situation. And ultimately, so there's one case that follows another case, and Rashi wants us to learn, oh, it's really the case of the man who hated one wife and loved the other that is a result of the earlier case of the man who took the woman off the field. And ultimately, he will beget a wayward and rebellious son by her, right? And then the next case is just a further extension of how this whole situation spirals downward. It is for this reason that these sections are put in juxtaposition. Okay, and Rashi that's the approach. Rashi just picks up on that same thought a little bit later. If a man is guilty of a capital offense, the smichuta parshiot, the juxtaposition of these sections, this and that of the rebellious son, tells us that if the mother and father spare him, he will in the end get into trouble and commit sins for which he will become liable to the death penalty by the court. Okay, now, this, as I said, it isn't really a solution because it continues to affirm some of the logic of the laws. But you see what this interpretation does, this juxtaposition interpretation does, which is to say, these are not separate laws of all the terrible things that we see in our society. This is an account of how one terrible deed leads to another. And things when you start by taking the woman captive, it's going to go downhill from there. It's not just that we want you to see her nails grow out and hopefully not marry her, but just know that if you do, everything will be a disaster. Everything after that will be a disaster. Okay, so here we have the third approach, the sort of like the Torah telling a story of one disaster following another approach. We're to read this almost literarily, almost like narrative instead of like a series of laws. Okay. So we are at time here. So I'm going to bring the conversation to a close, but I can't help but think, and I've had a couple of hands up the whole time, so I'm going to turn to them and then we'll close. I can't help but think that I can't help but ask, you know, what do you think of all this? What do these rabbinic approaches give you any comfort? Are you encouraged by any of these approaches, or do you have a different approach to the disturbing cases that you find in the Torah? Okay, I mean, that's the question that I think in some ways we'll just leave with, but let's just like hear a couple of closing thoughts, first from Ariella and then from Leah.
Well, I think that these approaches are there to give us a warning. Like, yeah, you may think it's a good idea in the moment, but, you know, give it a second look. And especially the one with the child, I interpret that as two voices, because I would think that it's going to be a lot harder to get both parents to agree. Let's go get my child stoned to death. I would think that the mother would be more of a reason. So I see that as you really have to get consensus from both parents, and that can be hard.
Yeah, got it. Okay, and quickly, Leah also.
You will never get consensus from parents when the woman originally was married as a captive. I think that the sages were looking at that, as has been stated before. The product of that union will be a rebellious child. And so they really looked, as you said, at there's no ridiculousness here. I think that there is interrelatedness, a wheel of all kinds of bad things is going to be set in motion through one sleazy action, one unthinking action.
Okay, good. So it sounds like actually Leah is compelled by the juxtaposition approach, the way of weaving these cases together. I wish I could keep taking comments, but we'll end here. But so Leah gives some affirmation to the juxtaposition approach. I wonder what folks thought of the writing it out of it never was and never will be approach. I wonder what folks thought of the speaking to the worst instincts approach. I wonder if any of these approaches is helpful to you as you encounter the pieces of our tradition that you are disturbed by, but whether these approaches work for you or you have a different approach. Ariella is exactly right that the underlying message of all this rabbinic work is that we never take the Torah at face value, okay? The rabbis are not going to just toss laws out. They feel bound to every word of the Torah. They have to make some sense of it, whether you think they've made good sense of it or not. But the rabbis are also, they are bound to the Torah, but they're not bound to accept it at face value. They don't take the Torah it is. They have interpretive tools at their disposal, and they feel empowered to find their way, as I said at the beginning of the class, either around or through these difficult sections. Okay, so difficult Torah today, important Torah today. Thanks you all for your Torah, and it's good to be back. I will see you again next week.
Thank you.
Good to see you all again. Thank you. Glad you had a good vacation, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great class.
Thank you
Bye,
all.
everybody.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.